when it comes to thinking bigger, this is why we do our network construction episodes. For those of you who don't know, Rail Natter has cornerstone episodes where we look at a region or an area or a city, or a country indeed, and we think about what that rail network is missing from a very simplified perspective, but actually a perspective that can only be, it is showing the minimum of what is required, not the most, the minimum, the bare minimum of what is required. What are those episodes though for people perhaps not familiar with our kind of network construction episodes? So let's go through all of them very briefly. What areas have we covered? So first of all, we have covered Wales, of course, cornerstone episode. That was episode 57. Episode 65, Scotland. We did the same for Scotland. Episode 116, we went back to Wales and talked about the Dragon Line specifically, the new north-south main line in Wales. Absolutely critically necessary. Episode 222, one of the greats. We talked about what the UK's, in fact, what the UK and Ireland's high-speed rail network should look like in detail. We'll be doing more on that soon in terms of service frequencies, etc. Episode 238, we looked at the South Yorkshire Metro. Episode 248, we looked at Scottish regional lines. And in episodes 256 and 57, we looked at the Glasgow Metro. Episode 274, we looked at Devon and Cornwall. And in episode 294, we looked at the West Midlands. So the question is, where next? Well, I thought that the place we should be heading to is Yorkshire in the North East, as I'm calling it. You might be going, oh, what is that? What is that region exactly? Well, it's kind of Yorkshire and Yorkshire outside of the kind of the conurbation around Leeds, so West Yorkshire, and the conurbation around Sheffield, so South Yorkshire. So it's those kind of parts of Yorkshire in its entirety, so including the East Riding, including York, including North Yorkshire, and also the northeast outside of Newcastle and the Tyne and Wear conurbation, and Northumberland, or Northumbria, because Northumbria and the Lake District, so the North Pennines and the Lake District, I think is an area I will cover as its own. It has its own unique challenges, its own unique reality. I think dealing with it as a single lump is more useful, or at least separate from this. And I think that the cities, West Yorkshire, South Yorkshire, we've done South Yorkshire already, and they merit their own consideration. And the Tyne and Wear area, its own consideration. I do actually want to look at the Tees Valley conurbation as its own thing at some point, but it's useful to include it for the sake of what we're going to do today. So that's fine. But firstly, what is this lump? Well, this lump includes Hartlepool, Stockton-on-Tees, Middlesbrough, Redcar Cleveland, Darlington, County Durham, Kingston upon Hull, the East Riding of Yorkshire, North East Lincolnshire, which is the little nubbin that's next to North Lincolnshire, York, here, and North Yorkshire. So that's the overall lump. Anyone who's seen these episodes before will know we also look at population, and then we look at GDP per capita as a comparator to other areas. GDP is an ugly way to look at the economy, capital T, capital E, but it's what we've done, so we'll stick to it. So let's get those numbers up, shall we? So the population here of this area is 3.058 million people. So above, just a chunk above 3.1 million people, 3 million people, just over. For comparison, for Wales is not dissimilar, so similar population to the entire country of Wales. Scotland's population, 5.5 million, is quite a bit larger than that. From a GDP perspective, per person, per capita, £31,000. Such GDP. For Wales, that number is 27,000. For Scotland, it's 38,000. So for this region, Yorkshire and the North East, we're sort of squarely sat between the countries of Wales and Scotland here. So this is for the UK, this is a country-sized area with a country-sized population. It's a sizable chunk of people, right? But what about population density? You can go straight to the census maps. This is 2021, of course, but you can look at the population density of the area using the census data, which is very useful. So, you get an idea of population density here. So, pretty dense in Hull. York as an area, less dense. Let's zoom in a touch so we get that. Yeah, there we go. So you can see, go on website. There we go. So you can see you've got pretty decent density in Hull. You've got little focuses of density in Scarborough. You've got density in and around Middlesbrough, but not a huge amount actually. But then you can zoom right in and get, you can start getting a clear picture of density. So, take York, you start seeing that there's some concentration of density around Beverley and so on. So, and Harrogate as well, quite a sizable chunk of population in Harrogate and Knaresborough there. So it gives you an idea of density. And what about our population centres? Well, firstly, we've got our bounding here, but you'll notice it includes Tyne and Weir and Northumbria, don't worry about that. That's because I was going to do that originally, and I thought, no, it's too much. I need to think about that differently. But so it's going to be included in this, but we'll just, everyone close your eyes on that bit, right? So let's start, as wherever we do, as you know, right back to when we read the Rail for All report by Scottish Greens and agree with it. We'll look at population centres from 5,000 above, but we'll start at the major centres, so those places with 100,000 people or more. And for our area, we are looking at kind of our study area. It's simple: Hull, York, and Middlesbrough, right? So let's go one step down, 50,000 or more. So that then includes Grimsby, Scunthorpe, Harrogate, Scarborough, Darlington, Stockton, and Hartlepool within that area, and also Durham as well up there. So you start an emerging pattern there. And for those who don't know how this works, these are our nodes before we start creating connectors. What about the 10,000 to 50,000? Well, you can see there's quite a density around Hull and Lincolnshire. You've got a little bit in the East Riding, a little bit on the fringes of the North York Moors, the edges of the Yorkshire Dales, places like Ripon as well. There's Whitby up here in North York Moors. Thirsk and Northallerton usefully located on a straight line between York and Darlington. And then there's this higher density, obviously in Tyne and Weir we get a much higher density, but you also this cluster around Tees Valley as well. And then if we add the 5,000 places, you see those clusters emerging, you see the density appear. A few places that need to be thought of in that wider space, right? So there are our population centres that we want to be thinking about the extent to which they are on the existing railway network or ought to be on a future railway network. But what about that existing railway network? What does it look like? Well, those of you who know will know that it looks kind of like this. There's a railway going in all directions. You've got a network that, well, on a map like this, it doesn't make or not make sense because the map is shaped around the network, right? So you've got a lot of this is the Northern Railway network, by the way. So the kind of everything that isn't an intercity service, except the stuff that's run by the intercity operator that also runs regional services. Next week, we're going to be talking a bit more about how illogical all of that is. But basically, what we're looking at here is services that come out of York and head towards either Leeds or across to Hull or down into West and South Yorkshire. You then have an almost totally distinct network. Oh, by the way, I should say Hull and also up to Scarborough, the kind of long way round, which is run by Northern. You then have a totally distinct network, right? With the hub that you could argue either in Middlesbrough being, well, I would say probably you've got Newcastle as the main hub for that network, the northern side. But within our area, the hub is Middlesbrough, really, with trains going out to Darlington. And you get an idea of sort of some of the other lines that they show here, some of the seasonal lines as well. So, yeah, so you can see that's kind of the network. It's a mixture of services that have proven work well, but also is a bit disjointed. What about the intercity, or at least the regional network? We know that we've got long-distance intercity services calling at York and Darlington as the major hubs. What about the regional network? So that's where we look at the Transpennine route map, and you'll see that the Transpennine route itself isn't much of it. Actually, the majority of that route is running up the West Coast and East Coast main lines, getting up to Scotland. But yeah, you can see that there is a bit of a kind of the network, the regional network, I would rather call it the intercity network, is focused around York, actually. York is sort of the hub for that with the junction at Southampton going up to Middlesbrough, but really you're talking about York as the hub of that network. But let's have a look at the existing railway network on the map again to see what we're dealing with. So let's switch that on, shall we? And here we go. We get to see the existing railway network, and suddenly you start seeing, the first thing you'll notice is all the parts of all those population centres that are not on a railway line. Pickering, as an example here, Hornsey, another good example. The route between York and Hull feels like an obvious gap there. We'll come to that momentarily. So there are some things that you can see. The edge of the Dales not well served by rail, as it currently stands. You can see that basically the whole network is based around a single north-south electrified line, the East Coast Main Line, and everything else kind of feeds onto that, including the lines up to Hull as the other major centre. So Hull sort of sat out on a branch line, essentially. And the other daft thing, of course, is that Middlesbrough is also out on a branch line, not on the mainline route. See episode 222 for what we intend to do about that in Rail Natter World. But we're not looking at the long-distance intercity network, really. We're looking at the regional and local networks, or at least in terms of where there are gaps we will be thinking about the strategic case. So you can see there's the existing network, right? And a lot of it is down here on the fringes of Lincolnshire and West and South Yorkshire. You start getting into the what I'd describe as horror show of the existing railway network that makes very little sense. That is a hodgepodge of competing railway companies with very little strategic view. Very rarely that you get a useful, this railway goes from here to here along a sensible route. This is just a scrappy mess. So definitely a mess down here. But the mess also sees reasonable frequencies, even if the journey times aren't particularly good because of the squiggly mess of the railway network. I'd say another big gap. Well, anyway, maybe we'll pause that for now. But you can see there are some fairly glaring gaps here, I would say, and some sizable population centres that are not served. Right. So from that, I guess we could think about what needs to change. And before we go back to our map, it's worth us talking about what should we have in our mind. You go back to the Borders Railway episode, in fact, which is kind of, I suppose, the one on that list previously, but it was specific to a project rather than a network creation. So there are three levels we need to think about, quite straightforwardly. We need to think about, okay, the local provision, fine, but that's not enough on its own. We also need to think about the regional benefits of any gap in the network or what plugging that gap might look like. And we have to also make a case for any gap to make sense. It has to also have a national purpose. It has to work on a national basis strategically. It has to work regionally, as well as there generally being, the local case generally is the easier one to make. Railways are good for local areas, but the regional and particularly national case are not necessarily quite so availing of themselves, and we have to therefore bear those in mind.